Hi, I'm Erin and I work on Classroom here at Bible Project. And this is a session from our Introduction to Hebrew Bible class. Tim is going to introduce two revolutionary ideas about reading the Bible. And you might be surprised at how simple they are. Join us in unpacking the concepts to gain more tools to make sense of the Old Testament. Let's dive in.
Okay. We are at something of a hinge in our exploration, a hinge point where we're going to swing from how the Hebrew Bible was written and the issues that I've tried to surface all raise, for me, the set of questions of, okay, how do you go about reading a text that consists of many texts, but that's been organized all together as a text of many texts of many texts of many texts? How do you go about doing something like that? So what I'm going to do right now is actually put a couple items on the table that are a little more in the realm of literary theory. But I find they were introduced to me and they gave me some new categories for how to think about what's happening when I encounter any text, but specifically an ancient text that communicates in ways that are foreign to me, literally foreign as a culture. So it's about adopting a new sensibility for reading an ancient text. So let's first start. This is actually hard. If people have grown up very familiar with the Bible, it doesn't feel foreign to them. That was not my experience, but that is many people's experience, maybe some of yours. And so the challenge there is to allow the Bible to become foreign so that it can become a new country to discover again, so to speak. And so I find that some of these tools can help do that. But it's also, it's just a good thing to recognize that we're crossing a cultural boundary line when we open the pages of the Bible. And just like you would, I hope, if you travel to another country and you care, I hope you at least read a Wikipedia entry on what the place where I'm going. You bring a phrase book if you don't know the language, but, making at least some effort. And there's something analogous that needs to happen when we open up the Bible. So here's a couple of revolutionary ideas that sound so basic that they don't need to be said, but I think they pack immense potential. A revolutionary idea. The Old Testament is an ancient text. Is it more than an ancient text? Yes. Yeah, think of the theme we've been talking about, the ongoing word that these texts can speak. But is it less than an ancient text? No, that's where it begins. It was produced in another language by multiple other languages for the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew and Aramaic. So here's another revolutionary idea that seems so simple, but it needs to be said. Texts are intentional products of literary communication. In other words, when I encounter any text, but especially the text of the Hebrew Bible, every single thing that's being put in front of me is there for a reason. When you become over-familiarized with the Bible, or I'm thinking, Andres, where you said earlier about the historical books. When you grow up with a conception of, well, here's the history part, I have found that acts like a sleep drug on people's awareness to read it as carefully crafted literature. And we tend to just think, well, it's just the stuff that happened. And you kind of, once you get the basic outline of the events, then you know it. Why do you have to read it again? It's why many people who grew up on children's media versions of biblical stories feel like they know the Bible, even though they actually haven't ever read it for themselves. So this is why I think this is helpful. Even just that little thing we did with Judges, Samuel, and Ruth. Like every little thing, little phrases, where they appear, strategic locations, it's all very intentional. So here's maybe a way of theorizing about this. I have a chart here. This issue that I'm about to raise is actually infinitely complex and interesting. That's not my purpose in bringing it up. It's just a helpful tool that got me thinking in new categories. These texts were produced by ancient authors. Theologically, I share the conviction of the authors and of this whole tradition in that through these human words, I hear a divine word. But that divine word comes to me through a human word. So I'm encountering another mind when I open the pages of the Hebrew Bible. So we'll call this author. And embedded in there is human and Holy Spirit and the whole thing. However, do I have access to a biblical author the same way I could have access to somebody who writes me a letter? Of course not. Somebody writes me a letter, that's an act of intentional literary communication, but I can give them a call and be like, what did you mean? Why are you, this is a strange word, or... So we don't have that opportunity with the biblical authors. And so it creates this interesting dynamic where even though the meaning of a text is what somebody meant to write, in the case of an ancient text and of the biblical text, what we have to clarify what any of this means is the text. So the author's pointing our way, in terms of I have an arrow pointing. An author produces a text, and that text reaches an audience. But the ongoing life of a reader is of reading a text. Here's what I think somebody's trying to say to me. Am I right or am I wrong? How do you know? All you have before you is a text to go read again. And this is true especially of literary texts that have been very carefully, intentionally formed according to stylistic conventions and techniques, that rich, extra dense texts, which is usually what the word literature refers to. So there's literature, there's email, and a letter is not literature in our culture, but a novel or a collection of poetry. We're talking about types of texts that have been so carefully crafted that you actually won't get everything on the first reading. And so when you're dealing with literary texts, it's actually through the process of reading and rereading and rereading and rereading that you gain more and more clarification. Some texts are designed to be reread many times. And when you're thinking of a text like the Hebrew Bible, think Psalm 1. How long, Psalm 1 or Joshua 1, which is a portrayal of the ideal reader of the Tanakh. What are we signing up for in Psalm 1? How many years of study and meditation? Day and night? Your whole life? I've come to really be convinced that actually should be taken at face value, to see the bigger picture. And all of what's happening here requires a lifetime of consistent rereading, which is remarkable to think about a text that's designed that way, but I'm convinced that it's the case. So here's what can complicate this, however. Authors, there's a literary theorist named Umberto Eco. He wrote a famous book made into a movie, The Name of the Rose. He uses this phrase that I found helpful, that all of us walk around with a mental encyclopedia, and you're building this encyclopedia from your first waking moments. It's all your memories, all your associations, everything that you've ever unconsciously or consciously filed away that helps you make sense of the world. Our brains are doing this with language, with our visual, audio, everything. Our brains are constantly organizing reality. However, based on the culture, time, and place you grew up, your encyclopedia will inevitably be different from mine. If we grew up with the same language and culture, we're going to share a lot in our encyclopedia, but it's actually impossible, well, I don't know if it's technically impossible, for two humans to have the same encyclopedia. You have an identical twin, Sharon.
I do.
And I'm guessing your encyclopedias are not identical.
No, I think he got a bigger set than mine.
Okay, right.
So, yeah.
So you get the metaphor.
Yeah.
So, okay. So so authors are working with what Echo calls an encyclopedia of production. They have their whole life experience, and when they write out of that encyclopedia. In the same way as a reader, when I come to a text, I have an encyclopedia, what he calls an encyclopedia of reception. And so the great challenge in any act of communication is to bridge the encyclopedias, or at least to attempt to make a connection between them. So I am an optimist in thinking that genuine communication can take place between human beings.
That's an ambitious claim.
It is an ambitious claim. And my marriage has been teaching me about this from day one, much less my relationship to my parents or my family. It's one of the most difficult things to, this is a very fancy way of actually just saying, am I willing to set my agenda aside and hear another person on their terms and not listen with the agenda of what I'm going to say next, or listen with the agenda of what use can I put their words to in my mind, but just to hear them for their own sake. That actually sounds like Sermon on the Mount, love your neighbor as yourself kind of stuff. And so in the same way, imagine reading the Hebrew Bible as an act of loving your ancient neighbor, which means learning something about their encyclopedia, and not just assuming that they are writing to address all the issues and gaps in my encyclopedia. In a way, think of the Christian coping strategies that we talked about in our opening session. I want the Bible, I assume, and rightly, that the Bible should shape how I think about everything, myself, the world, other people, God. That it should affect my behavior in some way. Well, I know the ways that I try and affect other people's behavior, and I know the way that I might try and help somebody come to believe something. Here's how I might do it in my cultural context. But of course, it's presumptuous to assume that's how the biblical authors are going to do it. And so there's nothing for it. Not everybody has to learn Hebrew and become a student of ancient history. That's like a much larger commitment to the author's encyclopedia. But you can make efforts to get a phrase book, and not land in another country and be like, where's the McDonald's around here, But, the equivalent, is often we might take conversations that come way later in the tradition about, think of any of the classic divisive issues, free will or sovereignty, slavery, current political issues, gender, political topics, theological topics. They're urgent to us in our cultural setting. We assume the Bible should have something to say. But what I'm convinced we need to do is, those are very important questions. But if I'm going to try to hear what the biblical texts have to say about these issues, I need to first hear these authors and these texts on their own terms and allow them to address the issue in a way that I've maybe never imagined, but that I will only get once I set my agenda aside. And so, in a way, this has been a long learning process for me then of, okay, how, and it's not just how did ancient authors communicate. This is a really unique crew of human beings in the ancient world. This tradition of the minority prophetic scribal group that comes from Moses, the way they compose narratives, the way they compose poetry, what they were doing with them, it's not like any kind of literature I've ever read before. And it's forced me to learn a whole new way of seeing the world, which I think is part of the point. So that's what we're after here. And, I think it's going to take all of us a lifetime to learn how to live with these texts. And that's okay. It's okay if it doesn't happen quickly or overnight, but I'm at least, this is a way of framing how to begin the journey, and that we're all going to be on this kind of ongoing learning trajectory. So what I'm after is what biblical scholars call a poetics of biblical literature. The word poetic in English comes from the Greek word poiesis, which means just craftsmanship. Like, think of a furniture maker, and every unique furniture maker has an encyclopedia of production, and that is what gives their furniture the unique style that it does. So the biblical authors have a unique poetics of literature, and you can see it in their handiwork. So what we're after, actually here, one of the great godfathers of biblical studies in literary theory is Robert Alter. I'll let him say it better than I can. He says, a coherent reading of any work of art, whatever the medium, requires some detailed awareness of the grid of conventions upon which and against which this particular work operates. Usually, these are elaborate sets of tacit agreements between artist and audience that create the enabling context in which complex communication of art occurs. Through our awareness of convention, we can recognize significant or simply pleasing patterns of repetition or symmetry or contrast. We can detect subtle cues and clues as to the meaning of the work. We can spot what is innovative and what's traditional at each part of the artistic creation. One of the chief difficulties modern readers have in perceiving the artistry in biblical narrative is precisely that we have lost most of the keys to the conventions out of which these texts were shaped. Now, he's hyper-articulate, and he writes in long sentences, but do you get what he's saying here? So this is what makes, when you go watch a movie, even better, there's certain TV shows where their whole premise is just to riff off of and create little plays off of things happening in other films and other movies. The longest going cartoon series in American TV history is called The Simpsons. Are they still making them? I don't know.
Unfortunately.
Wow.
But,
Okay,
They used to be great.
They used to be great. Okay, I mean, the whole premise is just that it's these really pretty generic characters that in each episode just take on features of characters from other stories in American art and film and literature. And satire, yes. There are whole shows, whether it's, a lot of late night shows or comedy shows. What are they doing? They're just creating little artistic bits or skits or sets that play off of things that you're just supposed to know about. And if you know about them, it's really funny, it's sarcastic, and so on. But the whole thing is built on you knowing what they're doing, so you can spot what's funny, what's the joke, what's the sarcasm, and that kind of thing. So in the same way, it would be so weird for, an alien 5,000 years from now to come in and try and watch any movies or TV produced by a culture, because you're just supposed to know. There's so much that's assumed, and we don't realize what's assumed. So that's what he's saying here. When the biblical authors are doing their thing, your awareness of what's going on is directly tied to your awareness of what's going on. So that's what takes time. So what I'd like to do is spend a chunk of time going through what you could call a poetics of biblical poetry. Do you remember how, when we talked about the history of the making of the Bible, poetry was the oldest form of oral history? And there's all these little excerpts of the oldest Israelite poetry that's now in the quilt. So my hunch is that the genesis of biblical literature is, and understanding the poetics, is going to be really connected to understanding the poetic form of this literature. So that's where we're going to start. Then we'll move on to a poetics of biblical narrative. And what we're doing is we're stocking your encyclopedia. so that as we keep going back to the text, we can inch further towards sharing the mindset of the biblical authors, which is, impossible in its full sense, but just like I'm an optimist, that we can actually understand what these people are trying to say to us. Okay, so that was a whole ball of wax thrown on the table. That sets the agenda for our next sessions. But thoughts or questions about that framework for what we're doing?
I think the analogy of TV is really helpful. Growing up in a house where my parents watched Indian movies, and the kids, in an American school system didn't. We never knew what was going on. But after a while, you learn that there are these tropes that continue. Like there's always the scene, the romance scene always constitutes a kind of chase, and then a kind of capture, and then ridiculous singing and hiding from each other and reappearing and whatever. Yeah. But it's like, this is in all of these.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So here's what's interesting is there are actually some elements to narrative art that are actually pretty universal. The protagonist has some kind of problem. There's a quest to overcome the problem. There's some helper or tool that needs to be earned or discovered to overcome. We're getting very general, but it's true. Narratives across culture share this. But we're going a step even more particular to ancient Israelite culture's way of doing it. And that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, you could create a catalog of different cultural features in film and art and narrative and so on. Yeah, that's totally right. Yeah, I suppose that's why some personalities are drawn towards, at least in American movies, it used to be in video stores, now it's all online, of the foreign film genre. It's a genre, right? For Americans, because of course,
everything else.
Americans are the center of the world, so everything else is foreign film. Yeah. But I remember having, friends that were really drawn because they enjoyed the disorientation of not knowing how to and they enjoyed the process of figuring out a different culture's way of, telling a story in film or something. So I don't know. I more prefer what's comfortable, and then think some movies are so uninteresting because they just replay the common themes and tropes and they don't ever do anything interesting. Right. And then it's called the Marvel movie universe, right?
Controversial.
That's just my opinion.
And then art movies intentionally sometimes flout those conventions to make a point, which I assume the Bible does too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So other thoughts or reflections on that?
I have made this journey myself, but I'm curious. I'm thinking about the person who would hear you set this up and coming from a tradition that teaches the authority of the Bible, or without getting into other terms that are used, but what would you say to somebody who pushes back and says, I don't understand, I don't see why I need to learn the poetics of biblical literature, because I believe that even though I'm not an Israelite, God's going to speak to me through this literature anyways. How do you address somebody who asks that question that dismisses this as unimportant, I guess?
Sure. Well, a very simple way would just be to ask them, well, how do you encounter the Bible? They could probably show you one. And you could ask what language it's written in. Let's say it's English. Somebody else has already done an enormous amount of work for you to help you bridge that gap, because I'm guessing that person doesn't speak Hebrew and Aramaic, and just the language factor alone. You don't have to convince somebody that language is a culture gap. So it's deceiving for people who grow up only ever encountering the Bible in English and not thinking about its historical origins. It's as if it hides the fact that it really is a cross-cultural act. And so just the language gap alone. Can I just assume that what the words mean in English are identical to what a speaker in another culture would mean by a word. And I think you could convince any halfway open-minded person that there's difference.
Sure.
And so, the language factor alone, much less the cultural fact. You can follow the same road and get more theologically controversial, ask them if they own slaves. Or that, like
What
just...
do you do if they say yes?
Okay, then right, yes.
Yeah.
But, you're just think through the Hebrew Bible. Are you an ancient farmer in the hill country of Judea that you can pay taxes to the temple that doesn't exist anymore? Because that's what most of the laws, the 613 laws in the Torah, assume and are addressed to a group of people living in the hill country of Judea. Yeah, just stuff like that, where you just say, okay, so those occur within a moment in the story, and most Protestant readers won't think that those are commands to me right now in the moment. So they're already operating with a grid of cultural translation, and we're just trying to draw it to the surface so that we can talk about it and build it out a little more. That's a very pastorally sensitive question, though, because it comes up when you're trying to defamiliarize something that some people are very familiar with, and it feels dangerous when you start asking questions.